She could see it, the likelihood of which would normally be slim to none. To gaze into the galaxy and make sight of any object beyond the stars themselves in such a vast emptiness of space would normally be impossible. For Lady Alune, it was a common practice. She was the diviner of her people, the one who foresaw any oncoming disasters from within the realm of stars. She watched distant galaxies turn and the blinking of radical quasars snuff out of existence. It was rare, however, for her to stumble upon something noteworthy that the rest of her constellation would be willing to listen to. "Come, gazer, step closer that I may taste the mind behind the distant eyes," spoke a dreadful voice. Her powers were unique, but never had she the need to be concerned about what she attracted with them. Something new, what she was doing. Strange psychic screams flailed throughout the empty void of darkness, carrying within their wake a malicious desire for conquest. It was an urge entirely unfamiliar to Alune, though she felt as though she could feel its intentions. A thirst for destruction and an unrelenting nature to dominate. These such emotions were not felt among her kind for a millennia, and certainly never to the intensity that she was witnessing now. A dozen or more giant asteroids drove in her direction. They were streaking through the massive empty chasms of space she reached her mind throughout. They carried with them a reddish hue, a radiant glow that varied slightly from one rock to the other, each carrying a slightly different emotion to them. They varied in size, but most of all, they varied in feeling. The closer her vision came to these molten rocks, the louder it got. These were no typical meteors that floated above in space. These held something invariably different than what she had the capacity to understand. She drove closer, tightening her focus, increasing her concentration. The strain of such could be felt in her distorted vision, but as she grew closer, so did the strong and unfamiliar desires. There was no doubt where these lost planets were heading. Though currently they were far away, they were heading straight in her direction. And as her floating conscience grew closer to their spherical bodies, she felt the conjuring of an emotion she had never felt before. Not in the sanctum that she grew old in, nor in the world that she was birthed in. It was an entirely irrelevant emotion, up until this very time, having never had any real use in the life that she had lived. She felt fear. The dream chamber was a gentle blue. The luminescent spines that climbed the walls breathed a quick sputtering light along with her projected aura as she broke from the trance. She began to slow it all down, as she sang a hue of calm and reminded herself of where she was. She shrunk her expansive mind and grounded her conscience in her physical state. There was no calmer place on this world than in her dream chamber, and so there she remained until she got things under control. As her astral mind felt the material world, she could feel the thin and frail body that she possessed. Her long and lengthy arms glowed with the etheric light that blessed all of her kind. Her smaller arms crossed over her chest, as was customary in most occasions. Her long and atrophied legs dangled like two tails out from under her garb, as the buoyant atmosphere of the world and the assistance of the gravitational stones in her sanctum left her afloat. Her long head possessed little features beyond ridges of thick cartilage, offering little protection for what was clearly the most vital organ of her withered body. It was her mind alone that kept this aging body alive, and it was entombed in a capsule that had no eyes, no mouth, and no nose. For what good were such extremities to an astral mind that can sense everything in its vicinity? Lady Alune took a moment to reflect on what her astral eye had saw. She would often drift into the vast nebulas as a means of comfort. It was where she found respite, free of the politicking that occurred between the constellations of her people. Her job as seer rarely ever came of use in the current age with a society so well established, and contempt with its current state. A seer whose gifts could dwell into the future or reflect upon the past had little use to those who were satisfied with today. This last vision, however, may change all of that. She stretched out her frail arms, gently knocking away the fabric cords that would offer sustaining nutrients to her body while in a long trance. She parted the door ahead of her with a quick thought, and allowed herself to glide slowly to the exterior of the dream chamber. The golden sky of Diveria came into view. Its two golden stars, one slightly more orange than the other, illuminated the atmosphere and remained in close proximity to another, their warming rays reaching only slightly through the heavily filtered atmosphere of the spire. Elune continued her slow and elegant glide across one of the spire's bridges. The open vastness of the outside world allowed her mind to reach further across the Combine. Traversing in public areas came with its own etiquette. An astral would cognitively connect to and lightly prod other astrals as they came in close proximity, like an informal greeting. These were only minor distractions to her, as her mind considered what or perhaps who she should present her newfound discovery to. As she made her way, she contemplated multiple possibilities in her direction. Although she did not know who first she should bring her discovery to, in the end it may matter not. Such a thing would soon be shared with all of her constellation. The people of her flock, the single thought or idea of one sometimes would pass the entire Combine in a day, just from the casual sharing and prodding of thoughts. She allowed her hue to brighten, and her aura became thicker. The gentle vibrations she usually cast into the world grew louder, as she now wanted to be found. She chose who she should report to, and in doing so she made her signature louder and reached out further to find the one she needed to find. Zai, she thought. The once leader of her constellation, and now turned radical, Zai was an astral whose curiosities would always bring him outside the comforting life of the spires. He took a fascination in the other, simpler life forms of the planet, and even beyond that, the potential life forms beyond their own star. A being who constantly thought progressively and wanted change. This was a radical mind in the minds of the constellation who found any change at all to be a huge inconvenience. He would be the most likely subject to listen to her story and the most willing to see it. Zai's meditative form twitched, but only slightly, as he realized he was being called. His lengthy legs were crossed over one another and brought close to his narrow body, as was his forearms layered over one another. His long and blank face tilted forward, pulling his conscience back to reality. He released one of his major arms and placed it in front of him. Within a second appeared Lady Elune. Spiraling blue globes broke into the realm with long semi-transparent tails chasing close behind, as they curled about the subject coming into view. Her long and elegant form floated before him. She was enveloped in golden sheets that draped down from her narrow shoulders, reaching a length all the way to her pointed feet. The etheric spheres behind her slowed their circular flights and began to dissolve. She had her usual seer crown at the top of her head, and a thin bracer on her major arm that shared the same decorative sigils that was on her drapery. This attire was considered to be drastically underdressed. Although modesty was not a thing in a society that saw all at all times, the lack of formal wear that often added protection from elements and comforts for cognition was not common of an astral outside their dream room. This indicated that Lady Elune had some form of urgency. Zai lowered his major arm, unraveling the others and his legs to elongate his form. His limbs shook slightly, as they had not been moved for some time, and were resisting. "Yes, my light," Zai incepted to Lady Elune. "There is something I saw," she began. She incepted her message, and recalled the memory, knowing Zai would draw upon it quickly. She saw no reason to delay, as a being like Zai would have seen it on the tips of her mind, anyways, and with his overwhelming eagerness for discovery, he oftentimes forgot the common social practices of etiquette. She was reminded of this, as her memory was practically taken from her the moment she began to incept it, as if Zai's will was the eager fingers of a child grabbing a beloved candy from a parent. Zai remained inert for a moment. His purple glow and radiant aura became shallow for a time being, as he drifted into her collected memories. Elune could feel him navigating them. Like somebody who refused to watch a movie from beginning to end, he shuffled around frantically, replaying different moments, skipping times, and experiencing the memory out of order.
"Truly," he inquisitively remarked, "it feels terribly awful."
"What do you make of it?" Zai stirred, moving around his floating self momentarily, as if to ground himself back to reality. His aura returned, and the room was bathed in his color.
"This is life beyond us,"
he remarked with excitement. his glow increasing in vibrancy.
I knew that's exactly what you'd see, but it does not feel good.
It is not us. It is something entirely different. We have grown comfort in our ways, and anything out of the norm never feels comfortable to us.
Lady Alune turned her head slightly, as if to deflect what Zai was incepting. She could not shake what she felt. When she reached out to the disturbance in the galaxy, she knew Zai would be excited for the idea and prospect that there was emotions radiating from the floating rocks as possible indications of other life. But this life was rife with such emotions, stronger and more radiant than her own people, which remained vastly more developed than any species they had ever encountered. Just what would it mean to encounter a life that had such raging energies and on such a different frequency than her constellation?
I implore you reach out to it yourself. I can guide you, but I assure you the discomfort is stronger when in recollection.
Lady Alune cast with indifference, as she did not feel the excitement Zai portrayed.
Of course I will, my lady. Did you only come to me with this?
I have, for I know not what nor how to present this to the council if I must.
Indeed, I shall pursue. Guide me now, if you will. I see no means for wait or hesitation.
The astral bodies drifted closer. Alune placed herself under the glowing drapery that hung from the ceiling of the dream chamber, joining in close proximity to Zai, that she may draw what resources were needed during her projection. Zai raised all four of his arms up as his aura began to glow bright and welcomed Alune into his sphere. The closer their proximity, the stronger their minds became, accustomed to one another, and if the two were to drift far into the galaxy together, they would need to maintain a closer tether. Zai had been a practitioner of astral projection long before Alune. With his eagerness and excitement to possibly discover a theory he held on to for so many generations, he flew through the endless cosmos, allowing stars to pass by him at incredible speeds. He only had to let Alune guide him in the right direction, and the moment he felt it, the slight disturbance in the voids of darkness, he left her far behind. As the feeling of Alune's projection faded far behind him, Zai drove forth. He felt wafts of energy crashing off his form, and slowed slightly, only to take in each new feeling and emotion he felt. They were strange indeed, most unusual from what he was familiar to. He could see why Alune greatly feared such things, or so he thought, as they were disorderly, chaotic, and unpracticed. It was clear there was something on these floating rocks, but that something clearly lacked the control and maturity that Zai and Alune carried in bounty. It was a species that may lack the brilliance Zai had hoped, but he nevertheless drove on. As the glowing meteors drew closer, Zai could see their aura. It was powerful and purposefully posed. This was the work of the arcane, no doubt. These were protected vassals, and when the destination of such floating rocks became clear, Zai did grow nervous. They were far too precise in their direction, and were heading straight towards Diveria. Comets or meteors were not common threats to Diveria, but they have been dealt with before. In fact, they are of little concern for such beings as them, despite their inherent laziness, according to Zai, as he reflected upon his own species. It was easy to steer the direction of an object that just so happened to be heading towards them. This was not the same circumstance, and as he continued to carefully feel and listen to these flowing emotions, he knew that there was something behind many of them. Although he could not help but feel these minds were very unlikely to be as intelligent as his own people, they did carry a psionic fragrance to them. The direction of these traveling rocks felt intentional, as if guided by something. Traveling with these cosmic boulders were a variety of colors, like a clouding gaze originating from their source. It was an aura of sorts. He wasn't sure if he could penetrate that aura. It felt figuratively hot, as though the generating emotions was so powerful and consistent that it created an etheric friction that threatened to burn his very soul. Astrals were not familiar with pain or discomfort, but Zai, in all of his excitement, had to continue. His projection soared to the surface of the rock laid out barren and voidless surface. Realizing what he could feel was not on the surface but inside, He drove through its crust and was immediately overwhelmed by a cacophony of wild, inflailing energies. Like tiny organisms fluttering and pestering a much larger entity, he felt the crashing of foreign thoughts and unfamiliar desires. He nearly drowned in this overwhelming bastion of sensations before everything had gone silent. He was being held, as though another person or another powerful astral asserted his attention and beckoned for private conversation.
This was an intellectual being. I must meet it.
Zai only momentarily felt behind him, seeking out Alun's aura to see if she was anywhere close. He wondered if she chose to accompany him, or became overwhelmed with the fear she had prior. Without any sign of her, Zai decided to form his apparition. Growing distressed with Zai's eagerness to run off without her, Alun gathered her conscience and decided to return. She snapped back quickly, feeling a drought of fatigue. As she awoken within her physical form, she had noticed she was drifting. Her body had floated just outside of the nutritional drapery alcove where Zai's form had curled itself into a meditative position, and in the process had accidentally pushed her outside the drapery. He was drawing vast resources into himself, and his aura beat quickly like the heart of a more primitive creature on the hunt. The dream chamber, despite its intended purpose to provide comfort, did not feel comfortable at all. Alun drifted backwards from the projecting astral being and decided it better to wait. She folded her dominant arms in agitation and watched as the withered and frail body of Zai twitch and contort, as it drawed energy from the cord's drapery across its body in exaggerated fashion. She knew he'd push himself far past the barrier she had encountered, and he would no doubt ignore the emotional warnings that she felt. Zai appeared, or at least he tried to. As he tried to draw in his conscience into a single location, he felt as though he was being pulled, yanked in unpredictable turns and angles, varying in speed during his transit. This was something he only thought an astral could do, to summon the mind's eye of another. It required potent, psychic power, and he began to question what it exactly was he was dealing with. He watched in fascination, allowing his body to drift down these demanding turns as though caught in the currents of a rushing river. He offered no resistance, only fascination as to where he would end up. Suddenly his conscience coalesced. His astral body took form, as if responding to his demands from minutes ago. He became an apparition of his physical body, albeit with a lot less flaws. An astral had the capacity to produce any image of which they could represent themselves as. Although most stuck with the resemblance of an astral, many chose to have stronger statures, more dominant figures, taller and without flaw. Dressed in a luscious red ceremonial gown with his head entombed into one of the great masks of the council, Zai looked up and opened his mind's eye. A blazing blue flame appeared, or so it looked at first. He saw the dancing tails of what looked like the tops of fire dancing about. Instead of cackling as they would when set at a fire, they evaporated off at the ends like some ghostly image. Fumes of blue encompassed the room, not quite an aura, but buoyant and fluid, shifting suddenly before slowing down, sometimes coming to a stop entirely. The haze was so thick that the room itself could not be made out. No walls or ceilings, only the ever-looming blue haze that kept all senses contained. Zai found this strange, and for a moment he almost felt trapped, as if his conscience wouldn't have the capacity to return. With limited capacity, all he could use was his mind's eye, and he looked forward at the blue flame which rose higher in the air. It suddenly stopped and pulled back a few feet away from him, revealing a face of sorts at its center. The blue flame rose even higher as he realized a body of sorts accompanied it. A massive body entombed into exotic metals with glowing runic sigils throughout. Limbs stretched out from it, two massive arms, with a size and diameter even in ratio to its body, were incredible in comparison to what an astral was familiar with. The creature continued to rise, revealing two extraordinary legs also bound in exotic metals, and woven with glowing sigils and crests that Zai had little idea if they held any true meaning at all, or were just simply decorative. He remained in awe. The creature was incredibly impressive. The muscular mass of the individual was mesmerizing, and knowing that his people continued to suffer from severe degrees of atrophy made him excited at the prospect of researching such a creature. Although the psychic might of his people were to blame for their continued atrophy, the individual before him radiated psychic energy and seemed to not suffer the same handicap.
"There are the prying eyes that watch me so,"
spoke a daunting voice. In its deep guttural sounds reverberated off walls unseen. The sheer physicality of the words being spoken practically knocked Zai over as he tried to hold his projected form upright. But these words were not only spoken, they were felt as though they had come from all direction, carrying with them an air of arrogance, a sense of superiority, and they held with them an incredible reserve of malice. It took moments for the feral-sounding tones to shape themselves into understandable dialect. This can often be a process for Zai's experience. But it wasn't only him trying to solve the complicated algorithms that made up foreign languages. The creature that spoke the words, too, wanted him to understand. The translation took only a few seconds before he could understand them with accuracy, and he felt as though he could communicate back to the creature. It spoke literally of eyes, an organ that had the capacity to draw imagery of its surroundings, a thing the astrals did not have. But many creatures in their world do. Zai wasn't sure if he should so literally correct the creature, given he was absent of such things as eyes. Then he shook the thought out of his head. He was being spoken to by a completely foreign entity, an alien of sorts that had the capacity for language and psychic conception. His excitement nearly overwhelmed him. He was surprised by the confidence it displayed, and how it regarded him as so insignificant, which he presumed was simply due to his size.
"Prying eyes, you say? I am intrigued to know how you knew I was watching," Zai replied, hoping to learn more about this fascinating creature. The flame began to move toward him as the entirety of the body moved forward. A skull appeared, shaping that of a massive creature, void as well of eyes, a mouth, and a nose, although it had sockets where eyes could have been, and a gap where a nose should have been. Curling and gnarled bone structure rode up out of the top of its head and reached for the sky, a feature Zai wasn't sure what the practicality was for at all. "I know everything about you, little lights, from the moment I first tasted of your kind." The growling reverberation in the chamber again, as though volcanic seismic activity was erupting from beneath. Zai felt his vitals peak, and was wondering if his physical body could handle this level of excitement. Something told him Malune had traveled back, and he hoped she looked over him, made adjustments to his supports if his body wasn't being sustained enough. He found it difficult to understand the creature. It sounded as though he was referring to consuming his kind as astrals do the light from the 2 stars in their system, as well as other gases in the atmosphere. How would he have done that? "Truly now, you don't know everything of me, are you sure? Unless you bring great tidings regarding a remedy for my ailments."
The flaming head of this creature recoiled back as it brought one of its massive limbs around. Powerful radiant blue gas flowed out from underneath the metals that encompassed it, as a hand of sorts splayed its massive fingers, which appeared solid as stone and charred from the flames that poured out of its crevices.
"I consume all."
The chamber quaked, and although Zai's form did not stand perched on the ground, he still bobbled as air currents crashed into him from multiple directions. The giant hand opened further and swung over to him. He was busy trying to understand the creature's statement and was upset with himself, as he could feel he must have confused the poor thing, for it simply repeated the fact it believes it uses his people as a fuel source.
"I believe—"
Zai's statement was cut off as the hand enclosed over him. His apparition exploded into dust.